Relationship with Canada may be as good or better, hopefully, than ever before.
No other neighbors in the entire world are as fundamentally linked as we are.
The two leaders talk trade, jobs, security, and say they're committed to deepening their relationship. But
when you talk about changes to NAFTA concerning Canada, are you talking about big changes?
We'll be tweaking it. We'll be doing certain things that are going to benefit both of our countries.
Trump vows to tweak the North American Free Trade Agreement. What does that mean for Canada's economy and millions of jobs that depend on the deal? Today's special coverage, we'll hear from Ralph Goodale, the opposition and former ambassadors to Canada and the United States. Hey everybody, welcome to the show. Happy Monday. Well, it finally happened. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is now wrapping up his trip to Washington, where he did sit down with President Donald Trump for the first time. The leaders emerged from a private conversation saying they've found common ground on a number of issues like trade and support for middle-class jobs. They also agreed border security is indeed a priority. Trudeau admitted he and Trump won't always see eye to eye, but pledged to navigate those differences and maintain one of the world's strongest alliances. 5 cabinet ministers joined Trudeau on the trip. You can see some of them here. Speaking with Vice President Mike Pence in a joint statement, the leaders said their cabinets will be following up on today's meetings in their respective areas. So what came out of the meeting between the two men? Is the federal government returning to Ottawa encouraged or worried about U.S.-Canada relations? Joining me now from the Canadian Embassy in Washington is the Minister of Public Safety, Ralph Goodale. Nice to see you, Minister.
Good afternoon.
So you sat down with the Vice President today. How do you feel about how that meeting went and the meeting, of course, between the Prime Minister and the President?
Well, I think it all went very well. This is the beginning of a new relationship. It is a big and complicated relationship. Obviously, over time, there will be things where the two countries disagree. But it's very important to have a relationship that is sound and efficient and works well, where we can make progress on important files where our interests coincide, and where we can be candid and frank with each other when we need to send contrary messages. And today was a very good start. The clear indication of an understanding on both sides of the border about how big and important this border relationship is, where we've got 400,000 people moving back and forth across that border every day between our two countries, $2.5 billion in trade back and forth every day. And we, of course, make the additional points that 35 American states depend on Canada for their trade. 9 million U.S. jobs depend on Canada for those jobs, and the relationship is roughly in balance both ways. So it's positive, and it needs careful attention to make it work.
And when you were talking to both the Vice President and your counterpart, did you get the impression that when you were saying those things, that was information they already knew, or were you sort of doing a bit of a sell job there?
No, I think those facts have registered. Obviously, in the months since the election last November, Canada has been very active, very vigorous through Ambassador McNaughton and a number of different cabinet ministers and federal government officials that have been working very hard to underscore these points, to make sure that Canada's significance to the United States and our North American partnership is well known and well understood. And my impression is that those messages have registered. And now the agenda is how can we make this work in a strong and successful way, in both directions.
When you were at the press conference, when the president was asked if he felt the northern border was secure, he said, quote, "You can never be totally confident." What did you take from that?
Well, I suppose there's no 100% guarantee in everything, but he certainly expressed, I think, strong confidence in the U.S. relationship with Canada and vice versa. We certainly talked about that in the luncheon meeting and with the Vice President, all of the ways in which we cooperate with each other to make sure that the border is safe both ways and that it's efficient and expeditious both ways. and certainly not in the conversation with the Vice President or the President or Secretary Kelly, the new Secretary of Homeland Security. Not in any of those conversations was there any expression of any doubt about that.
And the commitment to look at pre-clearance cargo, is that so, or should we read that as this is a thing that's going to happen soon, or you're just going to talk about it some more?
No, the language is very definitive in the communique. In the past, there have been expressions of good intention in both directions across the border about cargo preclearance. Both sides have undertaken to look at it, to study it, to examine the possibility. All of that tentative language is gone, and the communique today says that both countries commit to cargo preclearance. In other words, it is going to happen. We obviously have technical work to do to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is sound and secure and at the same time effective and efficient. We'll have to work out the parameters, but the commitment is now to get it done. And in the words of the President, let's move fast.
On preclearance for Canadian travelers, we wrote a story up, my colleague Evan Dyer over the weekend, about Canadians who travel to the U.S. by air, and will now U.S. officials be able to stop, search, and question them on Canadian soil. This is raising concern for some people in light of what we are seeing happen out of this administration. Would you consider amendments to that bill, given some of the concerns people have?
Well, if sound arguments are made for improvements that can be written into the legislation, obviously I'm always prepared to examine good ideas to improve legislative proposals. But one thing that I think is very important to remember: this legislation is explicitly, not just by legal interpretation, but explicitly in this draft statute itself, made subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Bill of Rights, and the Canadian Human Rights Act. In other words, all of those pieces of legislation take precedence. They govern the context. They establish the rules and the standards by which activity under preclearance will be undertaken. That is the ultimate safeguard. It's also important to note that this is a reciprocal arrangement both ways. It doesn't apply just to the United States or just to Canada. The rules are exactly the same and identical in both directions. So it's a fully reciprocal arrangement. And when people cross the border into another country, that other country has the sovereign right to conduct inspections and investigations. Without preclearance, all of that would happen after the fact, exclusively on the American side, with no legal agreement with Canada, no legislation governing the situation, and no paramountcy of the Charter of Rights. So actually having the preclearance arrangement in place is a distinct advantage to Canada because it puts it in a Canadian context governed by the Charter. It also means that you avoid the lineups on the American side, and you have twice as many destination points into which you can fly directly.
Just one last question, whether it came up or not, I'm not sure, but there were another 24 asylum seekers who made their way across the border there in Emerson, Manitoba over the weekend. Did that issue get raised about why that is happening and whether there's anything that could be done? Because if the president is saying he's not sure the border is secure, we're seeing refugees pour into this country at a very high rate for Manitoba anyway. Did that issue come up? Do you have any concerns about that?
Well, obviously I have concerns about that situation. It was not an explicit part of this conversation, although I'm sure issues like that will be dealt with when I have my one-on-one meetings in the next several weeks with Secretary Kelly. We haven't had an opportunity yet to sit down with each other face to face and deal with the specific security agenda, but that will be forthcoming in the very near future. But we need to make sure that we are maintaining the integrity of the Canadian border and the Canadian immigration system. We need to make sure that the public safety of Canadians is properly protected. We need to make sure that those people who are coming as asylum seekers are properly and fairly treated according to international and Canadian law as well. And we need to make sure that those people who are receiving them on the Canadian side have the resources to deal with those circumstances. I note that in the last number of days, both the RCMP and CBSA have indicated that they are making administrative and budgetary decisions to be able to deal with these situations properly. And I think Canadians have nothing but praise and affection for the people of rural communities like Emerson, Manitoba, and their counterparts in Quebec and elsewhere, where Canadians have shown the generosity and the compassion for which this country is well known.
Okay, Minister, we'll leave it there. Thanks for your time today. Appreciate it. Here in Ottawa, opposition MPs kept a close eye, obviously, on the meeting in D.C. What do they make of today's comments from the President and the Prime Minister? Did the right tone get set? Joining me from the foyer of the House of Commons is Randy Hoback. He's the Conservative critic for Canada-U.S. relations. Tracy Ramsey is the NDP international trade critic. Both of you, hello. Randy Hoback, you were down there for the inauguration, trying to make some inroads as well.
Yep.
How do you think the Prime Minister fared today?
I think he actually did not too bad. You know, it was the first meeting. It was a chance to break away the ice between the relationship and build on common themes. I think that's very important. So it's been lacking a lot of details. There's still a lot of uneasiness here in Canada on what the future may hold, and that anxiety. You know, I was hoping we'd see something that maybe would take that anxiety away. But you know, I think give him a B. You know, it's a good chance to go down there and make a fresh start.
A B from a Conservative is nothing to sneeze at here.
Yeah,
Tracy,
exactly right.
Tracy Ramsey, what about you? How do you think he did?
I think that they talked about some important issues, and certainly trade was on the table. But unfortunately for a lot of Canadians, certainly down in my riding of Essex by the border, there were a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of things that were left out of the conversation. So talking about the border and what's actually happening there, talking about the Safe Third Country Agreement, talking about softwood lumber. You know, talking about really specific issues that we have. I know it's the first meeting, but I think it's important to establish that these are things that we're concerned about, that the Canadians are speaking up about, and that it's something that, you know, will come forward in future conversations. Yeah,
I mean, yes, you're quite right. It's the first meeting, nor do we know exactly what was said behind closed doors. Maybe, maybe they spent 30 minutes on softwood lumber for all we know. I doubt it, but maybe.
I hope that's true.
On the NAFTA issue, let's just drill into that a little bit, because the President did say he wanted to tweak things, but he also made it really clear, at least to me, and seemingly to most people, that this is not really about us, that this is not a serious concern for Canada. Randy Hoback, is that reassuring, at least on that front?
It is in some ways, for sure. I guess it comes back to the details. We still need to see exactly what he's proposing, and that's what's creating the anxiety here in Canada, is we don't know what he's proposing. We don't know if he's proposing it under a bilateral framework or under a NAFTA-style framework with Mexico included. You know, we need to see a little more details from this meeting to see exactly where we're heading. That maybe would give a little more relief or less pressure or stress on some of the businesses here that are trying to decide where their future lies. You know, there's lots to happen, and I think that's good they've had their first meeting. I want to know when the second, third, and fourth meeting happens now, where they actually roll up their sleeves and talk about these issues that affect Canadians and Americans.
Yeah, how about you, Tracy Ramsey? How did you interpret those comments?
I think that it was vague. You know, what does tweak mean? We don't know. People are left to wonder. We know that there are issues that need to be resolved between our two countries. We know that there's wide support for a renegotiation of NAFTA. We also know that a lot of Canadian businesses and people working over there depend on that trade. We have a very balanced trade relationship. You heard all the stats from the minister earlier. I don't need to repeat those, but I feel that we need to talk about our plan going forward, and that's what was lacking today. When is the next meeting? When are we going to talk about what will be on the table for NAFTA? Every single meeting that I'm taking here on the Hill and back at home in my riding, NAFTA is top of mind.
On the issue of immigration, because obviously, both were pressed on this issue, and particularly the Prime Minister to sort of characterize the President's actions on his immigration ban that's now on hold. Do you think that enough was said by the Prime Minister on that front, Randy Hoback? I mean, he was in a difficult position and sort of said what Canada has done. Did he do enough on that front?
Well, that'll always be second guessed whether it's enough. Some people would say yes, some people would say no. I think he still has to look in his own backyard and look at the immigration situation out here with sponsored immigrants not being able to come, Yazidi women still not here in Canada. You know, he's got to clean his own backyard up before he starts throwing stones in somebody else's backyard. So
yeah, but surely you're not equating immigration problems in this country with a travel ban on 7 countries from Muslim majority countries that seems to be based on religion.
Well, if you look at it again, it's not equating the two. I get what you're saying there, but in the same breath, we've got our own immigration issues that we need to settle, and it's important that we settle those. And I'd be more focused on our issues right now than what the U.S. is doing in its own country.
Tracy Ramsey, did you want to hear something different from the Prime Minister on that front?
Of course, these are our issues. These are the issues of Canadians. I can tell you that in my riding, there are people who've been turned back at the border, people who need to cross for their work, people who have family over there that are being impacted. I think it's false to think that Canadians aren't being impacted by this. Certainly we see it in Manitoba, and really it's an opportunity for Canada to take a strong position. I think the world was watching today to see whether or not there would be a conversation about the ban and how it's impacting Canadians and the uncertainty that it's creating, not just in our border, but all across our country.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously it came up, they discussed it, and the Prime Minister sent a positive message about what Canada's doing, or tried to send a positive message about what Canada's doing. That wasn't adequate?
I don't believe that's adequate. I think this involves some tough conversations. This is our largest trading partner, our neighbor. We have had a wonderful relationship with the U.S. And certainly we can't sit back when we see something that's happening that's wrong. And it is important that we're able to have honest conversations. We heard something of that effect from the Prime Minister today, that we're not always going to agree. And I think that Canada has to be willing to step up. The Prime Minister has to be willing to have those tough conversations. And I think that will garner nothing but respect when we're bringing forward the situation.
And again, we weren't flies on a wall, so we don't know whether the conversation happened. We wish we had been. But so, Randy Hoback, what's the next step then? What's the next piece that you'll be looking for to see that this government is following up on some of this stuff?
Exactly like I said before, it's time to organize meeting number 2, 3, 4, and 5 with the appropriate ministers, the appropriate staff, to make sure we start moving forward. If we are going down this road of renegotiating NAFTA or a new trade agreement with the U.S., the more bankability we can put into that for our business community is very important. It's nice to see that Minister Goodale talked about the Beyond the Borders initiatives. C-23 sitting in front of us here in the House. I'd like to see that move forward, and then moving on to containers or cargo. I think that's very important. That tells me they're not talking about thickening the border. They're actually talking about making the flow of goods even more effective. That's a positive. So again, build on the positives. While you're doing that, bring up the issues that you have concerns with, and hopefully you can create solutions that work in both the interests on the concerns. So.
Well, that to me seems significant as well, Tracy Ramsey, that Ralph Goodale suggested that the language on cargo preclearance has actually gone further than it did with the previous administration.
And yet we see, even over the weekend, social media, a lot of Canadians looking at this through a different lens. When we were looking at C-23 and we were looking at this pre-border clearance pre-Trump, I think we were having a different conversation. Things have changed dramatically. Our border has changed dramatically in just the span of weeks. We aren't even really into the first month yet. So I think Canadians are looking for reassurances. We want goods to be able to flow. We want businesses to be able to thrive. But we don't want that to infringe on Canadians' rights.
Well, no, and the minister said that the charter trumps, forgive the pun, trumps all. So, I mean, that still remains in place. Randy, we wanted one more word, and then I got to go.
Yeah, again, when you look at pre-clearance, I just use the example of a train coming into Montreal from the northern states. Right now it stops at the border, they get off, they clear customs to get back on, and then they go to Montreal. Now they'll be able to actually pre-clear in Montreal before they head south. The benefits definitely outweigh some of the concerns. And having said that, I don't want to make light of the concerns. We have to make sure that we protect Canadians and Canadian interests at all times, and that has to be embedded in legislation. And I think they've done a good job balancing that.
Okay. And hopefully he's open to amendments like you would question him about.
Yeah. Okay, both of you, thank you. I appreciate you weighing in on an important day. We'll talk again soon. Randy Hoback, Tracy Ramsey, thank you. Is Donald Trump right to say the Canada-U.S. relationship could be stronger than ever before? We've got 2 former U.S. ambassadors to Canada. David Wilkins, Gordon Giffen are up next. We'll get their take on today's big visit next.
Well, we just began discussions. We are going to have a great relationship with Canada, maybe as good or better, hopefully, than ever before. We have some wonderful ideas on immigration. We have some, I think, very strong, very tough ideas on the tremendous problem that we have with terrorism. And I think when we put them all together, which will be very, very quickly, we have a group of very talented people, we will see some very, very obvious results.
Welcome back. Two leaders, two different sets of policies. But today, Prime Minister Trudeau and U.S. President Donald Trump said they'll work together to provide growth and jobs for both countries. Among the topics in their face-to-face, the two discussed the economy, specifically how to advance, quote, free and fair trade. Keystone XL provided a jumping-off point to talk about other potential energy infrastructure that will, quote, create jobs while respecting the environment, although there was little mention of climate change. According to a joint statement, the leaders consider border security a top priority, including initiatives, as we were discussing, like pre-clearance of people, as well as integrated law enforcement. On military matters, they talk NATO, NORAD, the modernization of both, and also a collaborative approach to fighting ISIS. Another priority, the speedy construction of the Gordie Howe International Bridge between Detroit and Windsor. So should Canadians consider today's meeting a diplomatic win, or is it too soon to tell? Joining me now from New York, former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Gordon Giffin, and from Greenville, South Carolina, former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Wilkins. Two ambassadors for the price of one. Good to see you both, gentlemen. David, so I just want both of your overall impressions with the day's visit, having been part of these kinds of things before. David Wilkins, you start us off. How do you think it went?
Well, first of all, greetings from sunny South Carolina. From all accounts that I've seen and read and heard of, it went very, very well. Very positive, exactly what I think both leaders wanted. I was privileged to experience Prime Minister Harper's first visit to the Oval Office in '06 to meet with President Bush. And I know how important these first meetings are. You need to set the tone, sort of set the landscape, get objectives for the future for your ministers and secretaries to work on. But really, the first meeting is about establishing that good, positive, professional, respectful working relationship, and I think that certainly was done today.
Gordon Giffin, how about you? What did you take from what you could glean from the interactions in the press conference?
Well, I agree with everything David said. Also, I was interested in some of the discussion at the press conference. Some people were skeptical that no specific announcements were made, but I took it to be meaningful that President Trump talked about increased and improved trade and movement across the common border. While NAFTA by name didn't come up, the conversation and discussion from the two leaders was very positive about enhanced trade, the extent to which the investment in jobs in the two countries depended on our economic integration. So I took that to be a very positive note. And along the lines of David's comment, there always seems to be a rush by Canada to try and be one of the first in the door with a new administration. The old wives' tale, if you will, that the first trip of every new president is to Canada really isn't the case. That's not borne out by history, but I think it's awfully important that the Prime Minister was one of the early visitors to the White House.
There were some comments about NAFTA, although vague, but I wouldn't mind getting both of your interpretations of them. The president saying that he wanted to tweak NAFTA, didn't seem to be targeting Canada in any of his language. David Wilkins, what should we take from that without knowing, obviously, how the specifics of what they said behind closed doors?
Well, I agree with Gordon. I mean, I think it's a very positive sign for Canada, for the president to emphasize increasing trade. And, we just need to build on the positives and build on our successes. We've got the largest trade relationship in the world. While you might want to tweak a decades-old trade agreement, you ought to go sit around the table with the intent of making it better and bigger. And I think that's what you saw today. So, I know there was some angst in Canada about NAFTA, but today I ought to reassure folks that the U.S. is serious about trade. We understand that Canada doesn't take jobs from us, and we don't take jobs from them. We create jobs together. And I think that message was loud and clear today.
And Gordon Giffin, when the president said it's a, quote, much less severe situation, what is that was that meant to reassure us? Because it may do that.
Yeah, sure. That intended to indicate that all borders aren't the same. We only have two, so he was distinguishing from the southern border, which had been a target of his throughout the campaign. I think it's also important to note that this visit brought together business women from Canada with business women in the United States. And I think it's quite noteworthy that involved in the dialogue today about business, about commerce, about creating jobs, were people from the private sector, not just a bunch of government officials sitting around a room talking about policies. So real people that have to create jobs were part of the conversation. And I think that's noteworthy.
And that was probably an attempt by maybe our government to make the business case to the president, David Wilkins, because that seems to be something that he relies on, the business case itself.
Well, absolutely. I know that when President Bush and Prime Minister Harper met, they had a business contingent that had interaction with the two leaders and comments to and from the leaders, and I think that's a pretty good plan. And I know that the emphasis has been from Canada lately with the visits from your ministers is we create jobs. We help put food on the table for many Americans because of our vast trade with the U.S. And obviously, the Prime Minister was wise enough today to accentuate that.
So let me just end on this. You know, I know both of you you both know the importance of personal relationship in politics. There's a lot of space where these two gentlemen are not going to see eye to eye, and I think the Prime Minister alluded to that, saying that there were issues on which they disagree. And I know we weren't in the room, but how do you think, or what do you see from that visit in terms of the beginning of a personal relationship? And how important will that be going forward? Gordon Giffin.
Well, you can't tell from the little bit we've seen post-meeting, but you only have one time to make a first impression, and my guess is this has kicked off the dynamic in a very positive way. And we'll just see over time how the relationship between the two of them, the chemistry between the two of them develops. I think it'll develop in a very positive way. I also want to point out that Ivanka Trump was part of the businesswomen's meeting today, and that may be one of the more significant aspects to the developments of the day.
Why do you say that?
Well, because she's got a big influence on her father, and engaging her in the dynamic of the business exchange between Canada and the United States. And she's got quite an interest, obviously, in the development of women's owned and run businesses. And Canada had some extraordinarily prominent and talented women business leaders at the table. I just think that's a great way to broaden the dialogue between our two countries.
And for you, David Wilkins, I know we didn't get much of a glimpse into the relationship, but it didn't go off the rails. I think we can conclude that. How important is that going forward?
Well, I think it's very important, and I think it was very positive today. You don't have to be the very best of friends and don't have to be golfing buddies. What you want is a very respectful, a positive working relationship between your two leaders. That's what President Bush and Prime Minister Harper had, and I think that's what you'll have here. So I think today was a home run for both countries.
Either of you hearing anything about when an ambassador to Canada might be appointed, or hearing any names? There's some names being bandied about, but I'm not sure how much truth there is to it. Should we expect that soon, do you think?
Well, it's all speculation right now. And, the sooner we get somebody on the ground up there, the better. That's important.
Yeah.
But we just have to wait and see.
All right. Gordon Giffin?
I expect it pretty soon.
Okay, that sounds like a guy who might know more. Thank you both, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Gordon Giffin, David Wilkins, good to speak with you. Prime Minister Trudeau also took his message about the importance of cross-border trade to Capitol Hill today.
Hey, Mr. Prime Minister. Hey, nice to meet you too. Real pleasure. Yeah, good to have you. Please have a seat. Of course. Thanks.
Here he is meeting late this afternoon with Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, Republican congressman from Wisconsin. Remember, he met with Chrystia Freeland last week. In that case, it was Ryan who brought up trade first.
Well, I'm from Wisconsin, so I'm your neighbor.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, just across the lake. So.
And you know how important it is for us to work together.
Right, absolutely. Like I said, you're our biggest trading partner, not just nationally, but where I come from.
was distracted by the working fireplace in his office. Donald Trump says he wants to tweak the North American Free Trade Agreement. When it comes to trade talks with Canada and the U.S., there's a lot on stake on both sides of the border. Here are some of the key figures that show just how connected our two economies really are. 400,000 people cross that border every day. So do billions in goods and services. In 2015, trade between the two countries totaled more than, get this number, $886 billion. Nearly 9 million U.S. jobs depend on trade with Canada. All of this makes Canada the #1 customer, you hear this from the government all the time, for those 35 states. Trudeau and Trump also used today's meeting to launch a task force aimed at helping women succeed in business. We'll hear more about that initiative next. The day started, though, with a photo op. Where else? In the Oval Office. Not too often that Canadian media get the chance to go in that famous room. Look how excited. This is fast-forwarded, so they look really excited. That was the photo op between the president and the prime minister. And the handshake, not so awkward.
must ensure that our economy is a place where women can work and thrive. And I think that's happening in the United States much more so. And Ivanka is very much involved in this, and I appreciate you being involved in it. And I know, Justin, in Canada, it's happening big league, and that's very important.
For me, it's not just about doing the right thing, it's about understanding that women in leadership positions is a very powerful leverage for success, for business, for communities, and for our entire economy.
Barely hear them over the clicking of the cameras. That was one of the scenes earlier today in D.C. Prime Minister and the President held a roundtable discussion with female business executives. That was after the two leaders spoke privately for the first time. The CBC's Katie Simpson is in Washington with more details on that. So this was interesting, that this decision to hold this meeting, to launch something together. Tell us more about how that unfolded, Katie.
So sort of the backstory to this roundtable discussion with women entrepreneurs and business leaders was that the Prime Minister's office, I'm told, went to the White House and said, look, this is something that we would like to do. And there was immediate cooperation on both sides to make this happen. There had been some American reports that Ivanka Trump had a hand in this. And when I asked the PMO about this, they had said there were many people that had a hand in this. But you saw that Justin Trudeau was seated right next to Ivanka Trump. She, of course, has her father's ear. So that was a symbolic gesture there. But Rosie, in that clip that you played there, where there was a lot of clicking going on, you heard Donald Trump acknowledge that that Canada is working on ways to make entering the business world, women becoming entrepreneurs. It happens more often, and Donald Trump even dropped his big famous phrase, it's happening big league in Canada. So he did acknowledge what's going on in Canada. Justin Trudeau, of course, has made it a point of traveling the world and talking about being a feminist. Donald Trump does not have that same reputation. So perhaps when the PMO did approach the White House on this, this could have been seized by the White House as an opportunity to try and maybe mend some fences or build some relationships with women, not just in the business community, but women who are watching what happened today.
Okay. While that was happening, the Vice President met with some members of the cabinet. What did they discuss? How did that go down?
Oh, well, we saw this was members of the Canadian cabinet that deal with military and security issues. And we know that NATO funding is a really sore point for the White House. Donald Trump has at length trashed countries that are members of NATO and do not meet their 2% GDP spending on defense. Canada does not meet that target. And although Canada has not been named specifically by Donald Trump in any of his sort of outbursts on the issue of NATO, we know it's been brought up at a number of closed-door meetings at high-level officials. So that is something that was discussed today and is going to continue to be discussed as more top-level meetings take place.
Okay. Thanks for this, Katie. Appreciate it. The CBC's Katie Simpson. She's in Washington these days, but coming home eventually. At the Women's Roundtable, Trump started his remarks by mentioning a gift that he received from the Prime Minister.
I'm honored to be here with Prime Minister Trudeau, whose father I knew and respected greatly. And he gave me a picture of myself and your father, and what a great picture. I will keep that in a very special place at the Waldorf Astoria together.
Let me show you the picture. There it is, in a silver frame etched with maple leaves. It's from 1981 when Trump delivered a speech honoring Pierre Trudeau. The former prime minister was being awarded the Family of Man Gold Medallion Award. We combed the CBC archives. Well, I didn't, but one of my skillful producers did, and found that event back in 1981. Take a look at this.
The Society of the Family of Man. Trudeau is the first Canadian recipient since former Prime Minister Lester Pearson won it.
There we highlighted the younger Donald Trump standing beside Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
I recall that it was in 1817.
CBC archives are the best. Okay, still ahead, more special coverage of the Trudeau-Trump meeting. Bruce Heyman, who just left his role as U.S. Ambassador to Canada, will be up next. What's his takeaway from today's visit? The governor of Washington will be here on Donald Trump's travel ban, what it means for his state. But first, what you've been waiting for, the Power Panel. Chad, Supriya, Marie, and Brad all up after this.
We want to have a big, beautiful, open door, and we want people to come in and come in our country, but we cannot let the wrong people in, and I will not allow that to happen during this administration. And people, the citizens of our country, want that, and that's their attitude too, I will tell you. We are getting such praise for our stance.
The last thing Canadians expect is for me to come down and lecture another country on how they choose to govern themselves. My role and our responsibility is to continue to govern in such a way that reflects Canadians' approach and be a positive example in the world.
That's how President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau answered questions when asked about the president's travel ban. Could it become a point of contention between the two leaders? Will Canada and the U.S. agree to disagree on refugees and immigration? Time for the Power Panel to weigh in on that and a lot more. In Toronto, Supriya Dwivedi, co-host of the Toronto 640 Morning Show and political strategist or commentator. Alongside her, Chad Rogers of Crestview Strategy. Not too far from those two. Well, sort of like downstairs and then over to the side in the newsroom. Brad Living of Forward Public Affairs here with me in the studio. Le Devoir's Marie Vestel. Good to see everybody. So we chose those clips to sort of highlight the one moment that could have gone off the rails. I don't know if it did. Why don't you start, Chad? How do you think that was managed by both of them?
Well, I'll say shout out to Canadian reporter Tonda McCharles for having the guts to do what 2/3 of the White House press corps hasn't done, which is ask a tough question of Donald Trump. Other than that, look, I think Prime Minister Trudeau and the Canadian team had a bigly day. I think there's an old iron rule for all campaign managers, which is that a plan beats no plan. Our American friends didn't have a plan going into today. The Canadian side did, and they got a big return in exchange for that. So I'm going to earn the ire of all of my conservative friends by saying I think Justin Trudeau had a great day. I think anyone who said he is vain or crass or hollow, Justin Trudeau could have walked into that briefing room and criticized Donald Trump and been a global hero and been a hero to the American and broader left around the world. He didn't. He said our relationship was too important. He was a total grown-up. Not only that, he bested them and had Donald Trump sitting at a table talking about, gender sensitivity and leadership in business. They had a bigly day.
We'll get into that part of it. Randy Hoback gave him a B, so you and Randy can be the two conservatives that thought they had a good day. You can be conservatives together. Brad, how do you think that particular issue was handled?
Yeah, I mean, listen, and I think it highlights the day that there were no distractions from either side, and I think that was contributed to the success of the day. The interesting thing is that, for many months now, during the primaries and the presidential election, Canadians have been concerned when Donald Trump talks about trade in North America context as being something that he wants to radically alter. And Canadians were, I think, rightly so concerned as to what this unpredictable president had on his mind. I think that today, a lot of those things, we talked about this topic on this panel many, many times, and that is that he doesn't have his sights set on Canada to the same way he does to Mexico. There are still some concerns too. You saw the release that came out from Speaker Ryan talking about opening up Canada to dairy imports from Wisconsin and the United States as a whole. So there are some still a lot of details to be worked out onto what today meant, but by and large, I think today was a relative success because there was no distractions that took away from the day.
And we've got Derek Burney on the show a little bit later to talk about how he interpreted those NAFTA comments, and we can dig into it too. But Supriya, your take on that stuff.
Yeah, look, I think this went as well as anybody could have possibly envisioned. And I'm going to rat Chowd out a little bit here, but on our way up, he was like, I have nothing to criticize. I want to criticize, but there's nothing there to criticize. And for anybody who knows Chad, knows that criticism often comes quite easy. So I think when you're looking at this as a whole, I think a lot of people were pegging this to be, our prime minister being some sort of representative of the global resistance movement to Trump. But realistically, we are their largest trading partner. We can't afford to be the global resistance to Trump because it will cost Canadian jobs, and the Prime Minister did ultimately what was best for Canadians. And I understand that there are progressives out there who may, in fact, be a little bit disappointed with him, but I think that is misguided at this point, and I think there are a ton of things that the Prime Minister said where if you just read between the lines, I think he said a lot, actually, without necessarily having to overtly beat the president over the head with it.
Marie.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think those who wanted him to criticize openly at a podium right next to Donald Trump were perhaps a little naive. I know that the NDP was really vocal about that today, saying that Justin Trudeau should have criticized them more and openly and made a big fuss out of it. Actually, the Bloc Québécois said the same thing, which was surprising to me that a Quebec political leader wants another country to come and tell you what you should do in your own country. I thought that was quite surprising. But anyway, but I think, I mean, there are things that can be said in private, and Mr. Trudeau seemed to say that there was frank discussions, that things were discussed. That's as far as he went in the press conference. But I mean, Supriya is right. At the end of the day, there is a relationship that they have to work on. They have things to build. They have NAFTA that we'll talk about later. I don't think it would have been the smartest move, perhaps, to get in a fight on the first date. But I do think that everyone says this was a success. I think the bar was relatively low because it was just the first meeting. I mean, no one was expecting them to have a deal on NAFTA, on softwood lumber, on the border. And I think things like the border could be something that down the road, they seem to agree to disagree right now, but it's something I think that could become an irritant and an issue because of bills that might come along, because of agreements that might be brought forward.
Or things you can't control, like actual security issues.
Exactly.
Yeah. Brad, Chad, rather, you wanted in there?
Well, I just want to say, I don't think we just had the first date audition. I think we racked up real policy wins behind the scenes that we're going to hear more about. I'm very anxious to hear how far along we are on cargo clearance, which could potentially lower the cost of goods for Canadians. Yeah. I want to hear how far along we are on some of our defense arrangements in terms of alignment between the two parties. And I think our team went in with a plan and got a lot of what they asked for against a team that didn't have a plan when they walked in the room with Canadians.
Yeah, the cargo thing surprised me because I just sort of read it, and then Ralph Goodale said earlier in the show, no, this is much further than we got with the previous administration. We're further along with this. So that was something. Do I have time to play this quote? I want to play this clip of a quote that the Prime Minister gave of Churchill during the press conference because I read it one way, other people are reading it another way. I want to get your take here. Take a listen.
Winston Churchill once said, "That long Canadian frontier from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, guarded only by neighborly respect and honorable obligations, is an example to every country and a pattern for the future of the world." That, my friends, is the very essence of the Canada-US relationship.
Okay, apparently when he said this, the president smiled because he's got a bust of Churchill in the Oval Office now. I wondered whether it was a little bit of a dig, like a
huge slag.
It was a slag? Was it
huge slag?
Huge? Okay, go.
But it was so artful, Trump wasn't going to pick up on it.
Just went right over his head.
Right over his hair.
Okay, anyone else? Brad, what do you think?
Well, I didn't read it as a dig at all, but I think that using third party to describe the way in which Canada wishes to be seen it can be an effective rhetorical device. So, but I don't know how much of a dig it was there, because the alternative, of course, is to arm the border, and that's of course not on in any stretch of the imagination. So,
I thought it was a slag about what he's doing with the other border and what he's doing by shutting down the borders for other countries.
I mean, I think it was more of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge reminder, like this is what we do, and this is what's been said about one of the greatest men, UK leaders of our time. Well, not my time, maybe your time, but somebody's time. And I think it was more a nod to the fact that going forward, the relationship is bigger than any one leader.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we get back, we'll talk about NAFTA. How does that sound? But first, as we go to break, a look at some of the editorial cartoons floating around this past weekend. Some humor, some might find them funny, to illustrate Justin Trudeau's visit today to the White House.
We have a very outstanding trade relationship with Canada. We'll be tweaking it. We'll be doing certain things that are going to benefit both of our countries. It's a much less severe situation than what's taken place on the southern border.
Donald Trump was asked about NAFTA and his intentions when it comes to that deal in Canada. Welcome back to PNP and the Power Panel. Supriya, Chad, Brad, and Marie. Brad, why don't you start us off on this one? Different interpretations of that. Should we be reassured? Are they throwing us a bone? What does that say to Mexico? How do you take it?
Well, I think it says one thing to Canada and a completely different thing to Mexico. But I mean, none of his criticisms of NAFTA, which he's defined as one of the worst trade deals ever in the history of the planet Earth, none of them really had to do with irritants from Canada. They were about low-wage jurisdictions, Mexico being the primary target, where Northeast United States jobs were headed to because of the trade deal. Now the question then becomes, what does tweaking mean? The challenge that comes from such an unpredictable president is that we don't know what some of these terms mean. Yeah. Is tweaking going to mean new tariffs and taxes on Canada's resources? Perhaps. I'm not wishing that, of course, but that some people may interpret it as that. But I think that today what we heard was an overall, he called our trading relationship outstanding on more than one occasion. You just heard the clip there. So you really can't see how radical he wants to be on changing the Canada-U.S. dynamic with the words that he chose to use today. It sounded like a very, very positive, and hopefully that'll allay a lot of fears up here. But Mexico, I think, is the one that is the recipient of his ire.
Mexico's in trouble. It seemed the president was quite restrained too. Marie wants it on that in his language there, because if this was a real problem for him, I think he would have just let us have it. And he was quite restrained with what he said there. With everything he said, frankly.
He seemed almost disengaged during the whole press conference, like very tamed down, and almost to the point that he didn't really care about
or he
Canada.
Or he cared a lot,
but it almost seemed like, okay, let's just get this over with. This one is not a big problem. Let's just solve this so I can go on to bigger and more important things. It's anyway how I perceived it, which can be a good thing because, as Brad said, Mexico is on the receiving end, and perhaps Canada is not the problem, or it could be a not so good thing because if he doesn't care that much, he's not going to go to the bat to save his business relationship with Canada either. And so I think there was a reassuring message, which we heard in the past weeks from other people in his administration saying, the focus is in Canada, it's Mexico, there's a trade imbalance. But he did say there would be tweaks. And I think if you start pulling on a string, what else is going to come up? And I think things that Brad evoked, but also perhaps supply management, which the Conservatives actually brought up today. Rona Ambrose brought it up. It has been a long time irritant, and it most probably will come back, and that's a big thing that could come up. And notwithstanding other issues that still need to be solved, like softwood lumber.
Supriya, do you see that as reassuring to businesses and people that are waiting for some sort of signal?
Sure, I think for the time being, but ultimately you can't just, pick, this isn't Jenga. You can't just pick and choose like, with Canada, we're just going to tweak it, and with Mexico, we're going to, overhaul it completely. Once the negotiation is on the table, it's kind of like anything's up for grabs, essentially, and I think he can have the best intentions towards Canada, and we can have a very good relationship, but ultimately, if the entire deal is going to be renegotiated, I think there is at least some cause for, maybe not concern, but at least cautious optimism that this will go our way.
Chad.
I'm glad that tweaking isn't a term just reserved for crystal meth users anymore, and we've brought it into modern parlance talking about trade. Don't assume that Donald Trump has thought about this more than we have over the course of this conversation in the last 4 minutes. What he's broadly signaling is, I'm not mad at Canada, and I wasn't hired to beat up Canada, where in fact I was hired to exact some sort of misplaced vengeance on Mexico for any of the economic malaise in America. Canada has an ace in the hole, though, in that negotiation, which is that when we implemented NAFTA, we did it over top of the existing free trade agreement, which still is in full force. So Canada has a robust legal infrastructure no matter how this shakes out, and that'll be the U.S.'s decision to drive that car, and we'll be able to have a good opinion. But just like the broader negotiation today, remember, America's not that into us. They are not ever as excited about seeing us as we are as seeing them. To quote Six God, Aubrey Graham Drake, when they hotline bling, we always answer. We will always be the junior partner. We will always be excited by their attentions. And they're going to drive the boat on this. But as of today, they said, not mad at you.
Yeah.
Let's be friends.
Yeah, I mean, we are not being covered on other news networks that are on all the time in the United States right now. Nobody really cared. Like, they carried the press conference, but they wanted to know more about.
In case something else came up.
Yeah, in case something else came up. But, and that's sort of it. So, yeah.
Or in case Justin Trudeau went crazy and decided to run a political suicide mission, which probably would have been good for domestic appeal for voters.
Well,
and done something destructive, which he didn't do because he's a grown-up.
Okay, Brad, yeah.
Well, MSNBC did run a piece on Canadian healthcare middle of the afternoon. I was diverted from CBC News channel just for a moment, just to see what the Americans were covering. So they had a nice piece on our healthcare system, which made me full of pride and joy. On the issue of, I think what the president did today was offer some global general cover, but I don't think that we should put our feet up and relax. I think that there are things underneath the surface. Paul Ryan talking about supply management, as Marie mentioned, that's got to be something of a concern. Softwood lumber was mentioned. That's got to be a concern. So there are going to be lots of things. And I think once that door is open, though, and the president says, "Look, we got to renegotiate this," it's going to be other actors within the White House, within Congress, who are going to say, "You know what? This has been." I don't like this feature, and this hurts my district, and I want to harm Canada in some way. So certainly we need to be vigilant, but I think we got that top line direction today that a lot of shoulders will go down because of it.
And to be clear, his trade people are not in place yet. They haven't even been confirmed. So there's not really anyone to talk to directly about some of this stuff. So that's part of the issue.
And as he runs around the world like a crazed, sugar-maddened child.
Who are we talking about now? Who are we talking about?
The president.
Oh, right, okay.
We're not going to be the biggest problem. I like the fact that we're the girl with the good personality who's just willing, to take a nice invite, or the boy with a nice personality.
I was going to say the kid with the protein deficiency who nobody really wants to beat up on.
There's too many metaphors going on.
Yeah, it's going in a whole lot of directions.
Yeah, I know, but as long as we're the person that gets hotline blinged, I think that's all that matters. Okay, one more round with the power panel after this. Stay there. Welcome back. The Prime Minister returns to Ottawa tonight, now facing an ethics investigation. Ethics Commissioner Mary Dawson has confirmed that she will look into the Prime Minister's vacation on the Aga Khan's private Caribbean island over Christmas time, and she will do that under the Ethics Code. The Prime Minister admitted to using the Aga Khan's private helicopter and then vacationing on the island. Trudeau has said that the Aga Khan is a longtime family friend. The Ethics Commissioner is now opening this investigation under the Ethics Code, which could result in sanctions. Back with the power panel, Supriya, Chad, Brad, and Marie. Okay, I'm gonna play one clip of out of this thing I think that was most unexpected, this women entrepreneur meeting that was there with Ivanka Trump and the president and the prime minister and the chief of staff to the prime minister and all these different business leaders. So let's play this clip and then we'll talk about what this was actually about.
All of us on this council are committed to working together so that someday we won't need a council for the advancement of women.
So that's what's behind the council. Supriya, what do you make of this? This is, from a prime minister who is a self-declared and proud feminist. And apparently the prime minister's office initiated this kind of thing. What do you think this shows, or what was the intent?
Well, I think the intent was to give the president a bit of a win and to have the president come off in a good light, to also curry favor with the most important woman in his life, make that of what you will, but his daughter Ivanka. She's been known to sort of champion these issues. I just think it's a little bit strange when you have two countries that differ so greatly when it comes to social safety nets regarding women and childcare. We can't really have a discussion with the U.S. when it's just like them and Papua New Guinea that don't offer any paid child leave. So it's a very different environment, and ultimately you can have all the roundtables you want, but until they don't have paid mat leave or paid child leave, I don't see what they can really do.
Yeah, Marie?
Well, I was just going to say, I never thought I would defend Donald Trump, but I mean, of all the things that have been said about Donald Trump and women and his positions or various declarations, he did promise to have a 6-week maternity leave, and he is apparently working on actually having that happen and having some cheaper childcare costs. So let's give him that. But in the broader aspect of it, I do agree also that I find it interesting that there's this big roundtable and committee that will discuss how to get women in powerful positions and in businesses and in the economic circles. But one of those leaders sitting at the table, Donald Trump, has 2 women sitting in his cabinet, and 2 more women if you count, the Small Business Administration head and his UN ambassador. All the rest are white men except for one Afro-American man. And so it's nice to want to talk about helping women get into business, but you might also want to help women get into high positions and positions of power by maybe setting an example.
Well, Ivanka Trump tweeted it after a picture of her actually at her dad's desk with her dad on one side and Justin Trudeau on the other side, saying it was important to talk about women having a seat at the table. But Brad, on the one hand, you have a prime minister who has put his money where his mouth is, and on the other hand, you have a president whose behavior has been questionable when it comes to women.
Well, that's putting it very politely, Rosemary.
Yes, indeed.
It's very polite of you
but you don't feel the need to be as polite as I am.
Oh, good, because I was leaning towards that, but I'll take another route.
Right.
No, I had no idea why this was on. I mean, to pick up, the jurisdictional thing, there is absolutely nothing a council can do for a North American strategy on women in entrepreneurial. Women in the workforce is a very important issue, but I can't help but be cynical that this president, who's been caught on tape for misogyny, who has a number of claims against his inappropriate behavior towards women, his own business practices have not been what he was saying today, the importance of women in the workforce. Even his daughter, who he's trying to get out of, I guess, of a bit of a jam down there, since Nordstrom's and others now, Sears and others, department stores have no longer taking her clothing line. Both the Donald Trump line and the Ivanka Trump line are made in the third world, where women's work conditions are abhorrent, and so it's absolutely absolutely meaningless for these people to sit at a table with Canadian officials, Prime Minister and heads of business, and try to play, to pretend that they care about women in the workforce. For their entire lives, they've done nothing, absolutely nothing. So I have to wonder whether or not this was merely a public relations stunt on behalf of the White House to try to wash away the stigma that Ivanka's going through, as well as the negative connotations that Donald Trump has when it comes to women.
Well, Chad, you've already said you thought it was a good move, but was it a risky move for anybody, or does everybody come out okay from that?
Well, it was smart. I mean, the team that they've assembled for Canada-U.S. relations with smart staffers like Brian Clow, who most Canadians wouldn't know the name of, or our ambassador, Washington, David McNaughton, but most importantly, the chief of staff to the Prime Minister, a lady named Katie Telford. They laid down the concentric circles and tried to find the first thing you're supposed to do when you negotiate with someone, which is, where does our shared interest live? And they discovered that with the president's daughter and anything that's important to her, they could find a way of meshing actually with Justin Trudeau's real prime ministers that he's applied to the Prime Minister's office. So I'm not voting for Justin Trudeau. I haven't suddenly switched party allegiance, but I'll respect good strategy and good execution. And if you had bet me $1 billion a year ago that Katie Telford would sit one seat away from Donald Trump discussing gender leadership in corporate America in the White House, I would have taken that bet and borrowed the money to make it. So I'm astounded, but that's what it is to have a plan when the other side doesn't have a plan.
Yeah.
That they went down and they talked values in a non-confrontational way and scored a victory. It also was a gift to Donald Trump because it helped put a little bit of salve on the wound of his general retrograde misogyny, as opposed to the other gift they gave, which was a perfect gift for Donald Trump, which was a picture of Donald Trump.
And the other Trudeau. So none of that is risky for a prime minister and a government that says, add women. I forget what Katie Telford's slogan is. Add women.
Change politics.
Yeah, exactly. Change politics. So none of that is. I mean, none of that damages that or influences that or risks.
These are serious women.
They're all serious women. But there's a guy at the table who hasn't necessarily backed up that before.
But at the very least,
Supriya, then Marie, then I gotta go.
No, I do agree there's somewhat of a risk there. However, I don't know if that trickles down to your average voter that's watching at home to say that, oh, now the Prime Minister is no longer our woke feminist bae Prime Minister because he was on a round table talking about this sort of stuff. I think ultimately, as long as the government continues to do what they are doing, which is promote women's rights and go about the way that they've been going about, I don't know if it really impacts the Liberals here.
Marie?
Yeah, I think at the very least they can at least say that they tried to influence the administration. And even if it doesn't work, we tried, and we'll keep sending tweets and posting videos where we show that we care about women's rights.
We've got a bunch of women cabinet ministers.
And to go back to Chad's point, I think strategically it was quite smart because, as Chad said, they're reaching out to Ivanka Trump, who is very important to the president. They are finding a common ground. They are finding something to discuss, and they're helping Donald Trump look a little better in the process. So I think for now, it seems to be a win, at least on that part of the day.
Lead by example, I guess, in this instance. Okay, everybody, that was, I needed you today, so thank you. Supriya Dwivedi, Chad Rogers, Brad Leving, and Marie Vestel. Coming up, Bruce Heyman left his job as U.S. Ambassador to Canada just less than a month ago. How is he judging today's meeting? What does he think about all the talk about who might take his place? He's up next. Stay there.
handshake.
That was a quick handshake to kickstart the Prime Minister's first meeting with President Trump. Just 2 seconds, we timed it. Far shorter than the 19-second handshake with the Japanese Prime Minister last Friday. That became a thing. One of the unsettled items on Donald Trump's Canada agenda, a new U.S. ambassador to this country has not yet been named. Bruce Heyman stepped down from his position last month after serving for nearly 3 years. Heyman recently told CBC News that he offered his help to Trump's transition team, but those offers were met with silence. So what kind of advice did he plan to give? How is he interpreting today's meet and greet? Joining me now from Aspen, Colorado, is the former U.S. ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman. Nice to see you.
Good to see you as well.
So what would you say about how this meeting turned out for both Canada and for the United States?
Well, this was a great day for U.S.-Canada relations. And, you know, these events are highly scripted. You know, the PMO and the White House have been working for weeks on exactly what was going to happen, when it was going to happen, what that statement was going to look like. And that's why those of you in the media are spending time counting seconds of handshakes and what was the body language looking like, and et cetera. Because the reality is this was a well-scripted day that went according to plan. And so I would think that members of the PMO are going to sleep very well tonight. And I think the administration is going to feel good that it had a very good day with our best friend and neighbor.
The fact that we got on the radar, I mean, obviously we were not the headline of CNN and MSNBC, but the fact that we got on the radar at all, which is sometimes a challenge, as you know, for this country, how important was that?
I think it's very important. I think it's an acknowledgement of the importance of the U.S.-Canada relationship, which I am going to continue to, you know, yell from the top of the mountain behind me that I will tell everybody that the U.S.-Canada relationship is the most important relationship that exists for the United States and the world. And so to get that attention was important. There was a lot of other news or potential news that was happening within the administration and elsewhere in the world that could have easily distracted the entire day, but it didn't. And I think that, you know, Canadians should feel very good about the attention that you received, and it was all in good ways, not in ways that have had attention on this administration over the last 3 weeks.
Given the way the relationship that the Prime Minister had with the former president, do you have a sense of whether this administration knows enough about Canada or is sort of getting up to speed on Canada? What's your assessment of their knowledge of what you're talking about, the importance of the relationship?
So when you use the word administration, let's understand what that is. First of all, for the staff within the White House, senior staff, members of the Trump family, I think they understand Canada quite well, and I think there's been significant interactions. With regard to the cabinet, that's just beginning. Last week, you know, several members of the Canadian cabinet met with the U.S. cabinet and secretaries, and it's just beginning. But a large number of the cabinet actually hasn't even been confirmed or sworn in yet. So we're making progress in that regard. But today is an important point that you're early on in the visits of foreign leaders, that you've received what I consider to be incredibly high-level attention, and the focus has been on the positive side of the U.S.-Canada relationship. So a good day.
And the fact that the president talked about tweaking NAFTA when it comes to Canada. He didn't seem like he wanted to burn it down, at least when it comes to us. Anything to be read into that?
No, I take it with a grain of salt right now. His trade negotiators are not in place. His commerce secretary is not ready to negotiate this yet. You know, they haven't even peeled back the pages of what direction they're going or what's possible. And this is a three-part agreement. So you can't sit down and talk about one country that you want to have much tougher actions with and another you want to tweak. I mean, that's really hard to pull off in a three-party agreement. So I think that there's much work to do. I think it was a wonderful tone to set when you're standing across from the Prime Minister, but that hasn't even begun yet. And frankly, as far as I'm concerned, the more time they take, the more thoughtful they'll be, the better it will be in terms of the agreement. I think the things they've done very quickly have not been appropriately vetted, and as a result of that, that's caused them some more difficulty.
There were some things that we didn't hear more about, namely a visit from the president to Canada. We get hung up on this, as you know, because you lived here. The fact that the president makes his first visit to another country. Gordon Giffen, we talked to earlier in the show, he doesn't seem to think that that is actually a tradition, and we shouldn't get hung up on it, should we? If President Trump doesn't come here, is that a slight to us in some way?
I wouldn't even consider that even the slightest slight. I would sit down and say, the reality of what you want to get accomplished with the Trump administration is focusing on the economy and creating jobs and making sure that the trading relationship stays strong and improves from here, which was language that was used. But I think the work that needs to be done in two buckets, which I think the Prime Minister is appropriately focused on, as well as Foreign Minister Freeland. And that is, bucket one is any future trade negotiations that are going to involve NAFTA. And the second, what tax legislation is going to be put forth by the U.S. Congress that may impact Canada in some way. And so those are two avenues that are ahead of us yet. And I think that the work that the Canadian Embassy is doing and others who care about this relationship, such as yours truly, will continue to give voice to that.
And you, given you did so much work on the border when you were ambassador, was it reassuring to you today to hear, for instance, that they are moving forward on pre-clearance for cargo, that there doesn't seem to be any hang-ups on thickening the border here?
So I think that there was a misnomer here, and I read the statement very carefully. There isn't really pre-clearance on cargo. The term should have been pre-inspection on cargo. And so we have pre-clearance operations in our airport where we're clearing individuals. We're inspecting cargo, so it should have said pre-inspection of cargo so that we can move cargo quickly across the borders. We've had a number of experiments of pre-inspection and test programs that have been done, and I think that this is something that would be very favorable. But I think, again, as I've talked in the past, we're going to have to talk about counterfeit merchandise and those kinds of things before pre-inspection can actually go through.
What has to happen next? So they've had this meeting that everyone thinks went, it was decent. What's the next step for I guess for Canada? Because obviously the danger for us is we fall off the radar. What's the next step for us?
Well, I don't think that's a danger, by the way. I think the reality is that you're in the sweet spot in terms of the relationship. You have effective relationships already developing at the White House and the PMO. You've already started, and you could see it there with a number of the cabinet all there and interacting with their counterparts that are taking place. That's what's going to happen. It's going to be at the cabinet level and continue to work together. And then, of course, the next phase is going to be this, whenever we get to it, this exact trade negotiation that takes place. The other thing is going to have to be with Homeland Security and General Kelly and the focus that Minister Goodale and General Kelly will do to make sure that the border is effective. And, Canadians use the term thick and thin. I have always said it needs to be appropriately thin for those things that are trusted travelers and traders and goods, and appropriately thick for those people that want to do us harm. So that balance, I think, is the one that we're going to have to continue to focus on. And I think that Minister Goodale and Secretary Kelly are going to have to work very hard to communicate together the things that they'd like to get accomplished.
And it'll matter who replaces you, too. I mean, that would be a big signal about what this administration thinks about Canada.
Well, it's always helpful to have somebody who can pick up the phone and call the White House and call the NSC and actually move the agenda along a bit and have that personal relationship. So whoever is selected, I hope that they have a strong personal relationship that exists in the White House and in the NSC, because that's the whole benefit of having a political appointee. You want somebody who has that connectivity that they can pick up the phone and make that call, as opposed to going through what I would call normal government channels that take place, which can sometimes be cumbersome.
Okay, good of you to make the time, Mr. Heyman. Appreciate it. Don't be a stranger.
Pleasure.
The former U.S. Ambassador to
Bruce.
Canada, Bruce Heyman. Thanks for the insight. Appreciate it. Remember, if you missed the show or you just want to catch up on a segment, you can listen to the Power and Politics podcast, available every night after the show on iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. There's also the Power Pod. If you just want to listen to the Power Panel, you can just do that. If you like what you hear, leave us a review on iTunes. Let us know. Still ahead, the other side of the same coin. Former Canadian ambassador to the U.S., Derek Burney, joins me with his take on today's meeting and Donald Trump's promise to, quote, tweak NAFTA.
It's a much less severe situation than what's taken place on the southern border. On the southern border, for many, many years, the transaction was not fair to the United States. Our relationship with Canada is outstanding, and we're going to work together to make it even better.
Our workers are connected by trade, transportation, and cross-border commerce. Our communities rely on each other for security, stability, and economic prosperity. Make no mistake, at the end of the day, Canada and the U.S. will always remain each other's most essential partner.
More now on that important meeting between the President and the Prime Minister today. One former Canadian ambassador to the United States advised the Prime Minister to try and not make Canada a target, since he said there's no relationship more important to Canada than this one. Did the Prime Minister take the advice? How should we interpret Donald Trump's vow today to tweak NAFTA? Derek Burney was Canada's ambassador to the United States from 1989 to 1993. He was, of course, directly involved in concluding negotiations for the free trade agreement with the United States. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Rosie.
Okay, let's just do one question overall take. What do you make of how how our Prime Minister fared?
I think he went well. I think the meeting went well, about as well as you could expect for a first meeting of this kind. I think there's a profound sense of relief on the Canadian side that it went as smoothly as it went. They didn't give away very much.
No.
I was taken, I guess, by the president's comment that when he was asked pointedly about NAFTA, he said they were talking about tweaking it with Canada, something a little different, perhaps for Mexico. I think that's reassuring. We'll have to wait and see. But if we were looking for a message of reassurance on the economy, I think we got it. If we were looking for proof that it's economics, jobs, and security that are his priorities, that came through in spades. And I think it came through in the joint statement as well.
So even if he's saying we're going to tweak NAFTA, what, and I know we don't really know, but what would we interpret that to mean? NAFTA has been looked at before. What would we interpret that to?
Well, and like any trade agreement, it's readily tweakable.
Yeah.
My interpretation of it, without knowing, would be that that means he's looking at doing it as an executive action as opposed to a renegotiation of the substance of the agreement, which would require congressional approval. There's a big jump.
That's a big
between
difference.
Tweaking on the margins, adjusting some of the definitions, agreeing on a new list of people to be able to go back and forth across the border. That kind of thing you can do without opening up the agreement and subjecting it to further congressional approval.
And could you do that then without Mexico? Could you put an executive order that would just touch Canada?
You could do it either way. You could finesse NAFTA either way. But you know, I don't want to get carried away with the interpretation of the word tweak. But I thought it was about as soft a term as could be used to express much more fundamental concerns that he has been expressing about that agreement. Came through to me that was, you're not our problem. The unfair aspect of NAFTA to Donald Trump is what it's done for Mexico vis-a-vis the United States.
So is that because that is based in fact? I mean, there's a trade deficit on one side and not on the other? Or is that, do you think, because of the work that the government has been doing to educate the administration about things?
Oh, I think it's partly a bit of both, but I think more it's because he's been targeting American firms who are moving plants and jobs to Mexico or to China.
Yeah.
He hasn't seen too many examples of them coming up north. So I think that's what it's about. That's where his focus is. Under a NAFTA umbrella, we have to watch and be careful about how it takes shape. But tweaking, I can live with.
The overall tenor of the press release, these things are generally pretty generic and full of platitudes. Was there anything in there that struck you? I mean, there is a commitment to sort of continue with some of the border security that had been committed to, including add pre-clearance for cargo, which I know this government is very interested in. Anything in there that stood out to you as important, or is it all sort of banal?
Well, I thought the emphasis on security was very telling. I mean, this is a president.
In what way?
Well, because this is a president who sees his responsibility as president as preserving the safety and security of Americans. Sure. Prime Minister responded that that's his job as well. Yeah, I think they agreed to explore pre-clearance of cargo. There was no agreement per se.
No.
And they've been exploring it for some time. So, no, I think the only thing you can take away from the generalities of the joint statement was the emphasis. The emphasis was right up front on the economy. Then it was about energy, the Gordie Howe Bridge. Wouldn't it be nice if they not only agreed to complete it, but they agreed to pay for a little bit of it? That would be too good to hope.
On the issue of immigration, obviously there were some pointed questions for both of them. Did the Prime Minister say enough?
I think he said exactly the right thing. It's not my job or the job of any Canadian Prime Minister to come to the White House and lecture the President on what you should do about policies in your country. What we are doing in our country is different. We're doing it because this is what we think works in Canada, but I'm not here to tell you how to do things in the United States. I think that was exactly the right message.
It was exactly the right message, even for a domestic audience, even for Canada?
Well, unless you're trying to convince Canadians who'd rather be Americans. Okay? I mean, that's the problem that a lot of Canadians have. They are more like wannabe Americans, and so they take offense at what the American president is doing. But he's not doing it to them. He's doing it in his country. He was elected. We didn't vote for him.
No.
But I think we always have this quirk, about whether we should be in a special position of advice to Americans. We've got to be careful about that. They may have had a more frank exchange in private. That's entirely likely. The Americans may very well have concerns that they didn't say in the press conference about the intake of refugees in Canada. That would have come out in private as well.
The press conference itself was pretty steady. There was nothing, out of the ordinary. Nothing.
Well, I was hoping there was going to be at least a question on NAFTA. I was beginning to wonder,
So
the whole issue came up.
Yeah, your favorite topic. Was there anything there did that surprise you? The fact that it was so low key.
Well, I actually was surprised that the questions from the American reporters included Canada.
Yeah, no, me too.
That was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah,
That doesn't usually happen. And I was surprised that they didn't go after the president on things that are more on the front burner in Washington.
So where do you think this leaves us then for NAFTA negotiations, or maybe just talks? I'm not sure how we would frame them. Or we don't even have the trigger that it's going to happen.
Rosie, they don't even have a team. People, the American trade team has not yet been confirmed.
That's right.
So I think the most that you could expect to come out of this is an agreement that once their team is in place, there will be an opportunity for us to sit down, hear what it is that they want to have tweaked, and react to that.
And we are prepared for that, you think?
But not to set our hair on fire.
Yeah.
And to try to send a message to the Canadian export and investment community that things are manageable, that we can keep matters on track. So stop, beating the drum.
And we did that today, you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
Well, that's my takeaway is if the Prime Minister's objective was to go and get some clarity on whether what the Americans are contemplating is going to be grievous for Canada, I think he came away feeling, no, I think whatever concerns they've got, we can manage, we can discuss, we can negotiate.
Okay. Derek Burney, we'll leave it there. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. State of Washington has led the legal fight against Donald Trump's travel ban. Up next, Governor Jay Inslee tells us why he challenged the ban and what he thinks Canada should do.
There have been times where we have differed in our approaches, and that's always been done firmly and respectfully. The last thing Canadians expect is for me to come down and lecture another country on how they choose to govern themselves. My role and our responsibility is to continue to govern in such a way that reflects Canadians' approach and be a positive example in the world.
have some wonderful ideas on immigration. We have some, I think, very strong, very tough ideas on the tremendous problem that we have with terrorism. And I think when we put them all together, which will be very, very quickly, we have a group of very talented people, we will see some very, very obvious results.
Immigration, obviously, one of the agenda items during that meeting between the Prime Minister and the President today. Unclear whether Trump's controversial travel ban was discussed in any detail. The immigration order, though, has been suspended by the American justice system for now. And that's in part because of the state of Washington, who has led the fight to get the ban suspended. What case did the state make about the impact it would have on them? Joining me now by Skype from Olympia, Washington, is the governor of Washington, Jay Inslee. Nice to see you, Governor.
Good morning.
So you had another victory last week with the travel ban. The appeals court decided to uphold that suspension. Why did you start this legal challenge in the first place?
Well, our state is damaged by this executive order of the president's. It causes not only individual harm to families who cannot be reunited, to trauma associated with being kicked out of the country after going through a 2 or 3 year vetting program to get here, but it causes damage to the whole state, even folks who are not individually affected. It hurts our businesses. We obviously have a very high-tech, export-oriented state. It's very difficult to sell products when your salesman can't come and go to the places we want to sell our products. We sell a lot of software, the best jets in the world, and if our salespeople can't travel, that impedes our progress. Our universities are doing world-class research. At the University of Washington, there's a young fellow, he's a PhD candidate, originally from Iran. He's doing HIV research, and he wasn't able to do his research, come back to complete his research. We had a minister for the World Health Organization who was barred from coming to the University of Washington. So this hurts our business, and it does hurt our national security as well, I believe, because essentially it helps the ISIS narrative that somehow America is against the Muslim religion. And that is a recruiting poster for ISIS. Many national security advisors and experts have said that. In fact, we had 12 of them testify in our lawsuit. So it's individually destructive, it's inhumane, it hurts our economy, and it really degrades our national security rather than increasing it. So we felt it was appropriate for Washington to do what we do a lot in our country, which is lead. And we filed the first lawsuit, and we've had some really good results from 4 judges. 2 of whom, I might add, were appointed by Republican presidents. So we've now had 4 judges. They've all reached the same conclusion, which is that we have a likelihood of success on our claims. We're gratified.
So when the president, after the initial ruling, tweeted about the so-called judge and said that he was putting the country in peril from a security perspective, because he really does believe this is about security, what was your reaction and what were your concerns to hear that from the president?
Well, first off, it was not helpful for the court to insult and personally attack these judges. Look, these judges, they have lifetime tenure. They're not politicians. They don't have to run for office. They call them as they see them. And 4 of them, including 2 appointed by Republican presidents, made a clear call in this regard. So it was most unhelpful for the president. One of the really pillars of American democracy are respecting the judicial system. And I've never seen a president try to undermine the judicial system and the respect for the judicial system like this president has done. It's very, very, very disturbing to me. By the way, the president says he'll see us in court. We saw him in court. We beat him twice. So we saw him in court. Now, the national security aspect of this, look, the courts looked at this issue. Courts do not issue temporary restraining orders on a whim. They evaluated the president's claim. He came in and said, well, this is a national security issue. And the judges said, well, show us your evidence. Show us what you have. They put nothing on. They didn't provide a shred of evidence that would suggest that they have intelligence suggesting that this is an inordinate or extraordinary danger relative to many of the other places. Look, terrorists can come from France and Germany, too. These are the most highly vetted people that enter our country. And the facts that came out during the trial or the hearing was that of 700,000 people since 2001, there hasn't been one single fatal terrorist attack by people from these 7 countries. So in our court system in America, the evidence prevails, the Constitution prevails. Tweets need to take a back seat, and that's why we won.
And if the president follows through now on the possibility of a new executive order, one that is perhaps more legally sound, that is better crafted and better implemented, would that be something that you would fight again? Is there any sort of executive order here that would make sense from a security perspective for you?
We don't know. We'll evaluate whatever the president does.
Yeah.
It's going to need to follow the Constitution. It's going to need to follow the law. And it's going to need to not degrade our economy without any national security benefits. Now, there may be some things you can do to have better data keeping or something. Maybe there's things that they can improve our vetting process. We should look at those. But the Constitution is going to need to be followed. We're not going to be able to have religious tests in this country. This president, for the first time in American history, tried to create a religious test as who comes into our country. That is not acceptable in America, to put Muslims in the back of the bus, as he wanted to do, as he said he wanted to do. He wanted to put other religions ahead of Muslims on the priority list. That is not consistent with the U.S. Constitution or who we are as a people. So that's not going to cut it. And we will be diligent looking at what the president's doing from here on in.
I want to ask you about our prime minister, if I can, because he's meeting with the president today. Canadians have been concerned about this ban. Our prime minister sort of tweeted about it in a roundabout way. Also concerned about trade, obviously. We're expecting that to be a big conversation. From your perspective, what would you tell the president about the relationship between Canada and the United States?
Well, I would just express how important it is. Look, this trading relationship and cultural relationship is so important. We work in so many ways with our immediate neighbor, British Columbia. We've got good work going on climate change issues. We're trying to establish a corridor for high-tech research up and down the I-5 corridor from Vancouver to Seattle. Bill Gates is actually the Gates Foundation helping promote that effort. So it's a very, very close relationship. I hope he'll approach it with a mature and respectful approach rather than some of the tweet storms that can cause damage in any relationship, including an international one. We hope the president will treat Canada that way.
Okay, Governor, good of you to make the time for Canada today. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Still ahead, we'll run through some of the highlights of Justin Trudeau's big trip to Washington and his first face-to-face meeting with the president. welcome back. Well, it's finally happened. A busy day for the Prime Minister as he ends a whirlwind trip to Washington. The President greeted the Prime Minister outside the White House this morning with just a firm handshake and some smiles, too. Here's more of the day, marking the very first face-to-face meeting of the two leaders.
I think they might want a handshake.
I'm honored to be here
with Prime Minister Trudeau, whose father I knew and respected greatly.
For me, it's not just about doing the right thing, it's about understanding that women in leadership positions is a very powerful leverage for success, for business, for communities, and for our entire economy.
From my past life, I had so many women executives that were phenomenal.
The President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada.
We are going to have a great relationship with Canada, maybe as good or better, hopefully, than ever before.
Make no mistake, at the end of the day, Canada and the U.S. will always remain each other's most essential partner.
Mr. Prime Minister, I look forward to working closely with you to build upon our very historic friendship.
But there have been times where we have differed in our approaches, and that's always been done firmly and respectfully. The last thing Canadians expect is for me to come down and lecture another country on how they choose to govern themselves.
We have a very outstanding trade relationship with Canada. We'll be tweaking it. We'll be doing certain things that are going to benefit both of our countries. It's a much less severe situation than what's taken place on the southern border. On the southern border, for many, many years, the transaction was not fair to the United States. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Prime Minister. Hey, nice to meet you too. Yeah, good to have you. Please, thank you. Of course. Thanks. You're our biggest trading partner, not just nationally, but where I come from. So.
$11 billion in trade.
Yeah, the only problem we have is you steal our good hockey players. That's our problem.
It's not our fault if they want to come play for us. You know, we have better teams.
We're glad to have the Canadian Prime Minister here this afternoon. I know you've got a chance to meet with the President. Welcome to town.
I'm glad we'll have an opportunity to chat now about all the different ways in which the Canadian and American economies are well integrated with good jobs on both sides of the border, and how we can always work together better for the mutual benefit of our citizens.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. All right.
And there you go. It's done. The first meeting is always the hardest. No word yet on if the President will indeed take the Prime Minister up on a visit to Ottawa. And we're still, of course, waiting to find out who the new U.S. ambassador to Canada will be. That announcement still to come as well. All right, there's lots more coverage tonight on the National here on CBC News Network at 9 p.m. Eastern. I'm Rosemary Barton. On the Money has more on the meeting as well. That's coming up next. It's only Monday, and all that has already happened. See you back here tomorrow at 5 Eastern. Bye-bye.